No one who wasn't there can imagine the circumstances. The Hungarian fascists, the Arrow-Cross people, going around with rifles and shooting people and gathering up all the Jews, going from house to house. And God knows how often did we survive by the width of a hair.
Now when the Russians came in, from all the 42 people, I was the 43rd, we were just 12. The others were shut down to the Danube or taken to somewhere else.
The bombs I was never afraid of. It was the Arrow-Cross, because that was more personal.
As I sit here on the Pest side of the Danube River, with the beautiful hills of Buda behind me, it's hard to imagine that nearly 60 years ago, this river was red with the blood of Jews murdered by the Nazis.
From 1939 to 1945, World War II was raging in Europe. Germany fought two wars, one against the Allies and one against the Jews. For the first time in history, a government made the destruction of a race its central ideology and built an industry to murder innocent civilians. The Germans also had the enthusiastic cooperation of a large segment of the local populations in the occupied lands. By 1944, Hungary was the only country allied with Germany where Jews still lived in relative safety.
By this time, the Germans had such expertise in the extermination of Jews that with the help of the local gendarmerie, they were able to deport 450,000 men, women, and children within 3 months. Most were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Even though during the Second World War, Hungary was an ally of Germany, the Hungarian government did not allow the deportation of the approximately 800,000 Jews living here. On March 19, 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary, and the fate of the last remaining large Jewish community in Europe was sealed. The Jews of Budapest would be the last to be deported. This is the story of how thousands of Jews living right here in Budapest were saved by the courageous diplomats of neutral countries who risked their own lives to save the lives of complete strangers. It is also the story of some of those Jews who were saved by the heroic efforts of these diplomats, some of whom have contributed much to modern society. Among the heroes this film focuses on, our thanks and deepest gratitude are extended to Ambassador Per Unger, Ambassador Angel Sanbris, Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, Monsignor Angelo Rota, and Giorgio Perlasca. Ambassador Unger recalls the events of nearly 6 decades ago.
All this started after the German occupation of Hungary on the 19th of March 1944.
The head of the Hungarian government, Regent Horthy, was summoned for a meeting with Hitler in Germany on March 18, 1944. Taking advantage of his absence, the German army occupied Hungary on March 19th and effectively took over control of the country by forcing the appointment of local Nazi followers to key positions.
Before that, there had been no serious actions against the Jews. It came as a surprise the day when the Germans invaded, and then the Jewish population, the Jews in Budapest understood that doomsday had come. Valdemar Langley was a professor teaching at the university, Swedish language. At the same time, he was attached to the embassy as a kind of a culture attaché. So he was one of the staff, and he knew Hungary very well. So when all this started, the persecution of the Jewish people, he was the alarm clock. He said the very day when the Germans came, now this is going to happen here, and now we have to do something.
New anti-Jewish measures were announced daily. Effective April 4th, 1944, the First Order marked all Jews by ordering them to wear a yellow Star of David on their outer garments.
It was very humiliating to go to school with the yellow star. I think it was April 4th, 1944.
I didn't feel humiliated until I was walking on the street and somebody spit at me and says, stinking Jew. And that was the point when I felt totally devastated.
I remember very well how a Swedish and Hungarian who was the head of a big Swedish company, his name was Hugo Wall, and he came up to me an evening in my home. It was just after the German occupation, and said, you have to do something, you have to help us, you have to help me, and so on. And I said, what can I do? I mean, I thought for a while, and then I came up with this idea to give him, to start with, a provisional Swedish passport. It wasn't legal, really, to give it to foreigners, but I said we have to do something to save people's lives. So I issued on my own to start with some provisional passports, and that was approved afterwards, I'm very happy to say, afterwards by the Swedish government. And that was the start.
The Swedish legation began to issue protective passes for Jews. Judith Volley recalls the day that she became part of that operation.
I went to the Swedish legation to apply for passports. When I arrived, I saw a long line of Jews. The line was moving very slowly. I realized that I would not get in there that day or any other day. It was a beautiful day in May, and the employees were typing in the garden. I decided to take a chance and removed my yellow star in a house around the corner and passed the guards at the gate, pretending that I was an employee at the legation. Once inside, I offered my help and sat down to type protective passports. The head of the operation, Hugo Wall, saw that I was working very efficiently and offered me the job.
In May, the deportation of the Jews to Auschwitz outside of Budapest was in full force at a rate of 10,000 people per day. When the news reached Archbishop Angelo Rota, the papal nuncio, he immediately lodged a protest to the Hungarian government. Archbishop Verolino, Monsignor Rota's second-in-command, recalls.
As soon as the nuncio heard about the deportations of the Jews, we lodged a protest with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Ministry. There were many protests to follow, without any effect on the government's actions. That is why the nuncio organized the first meeting of the diplomats and had the diplomatic corps submit a joint protest to the Hungarian government.
When people are persecuted and deported, and you will see that and you are looking at the situation, you have to help.
The most important thing that inspired my father is that he was an extremely fair person. He just couldn't bear the atrocities that he was seeing, and he decided to rescue all these innocent people because he really believed as a human being that it was his duty.
He was a deeply religious man. He was brought up in a Methodist family. He was the second youngest of 10 children, and religion meant a lot to him. When he saw the terrible situation of the Jews, but it didn't matter whether they were Jews, could have been any other people who were in danger, he thought he had to do something.
In Budapest, preparations began for the deportation of more than 200,000 remaining Jews. First, they were ordered to leave their homes and move in with other Jews into buildings designated with a yellow star. In 8 days in June, these 200,000 people were forced to move from 10,000 apartment buildings into 1,840. They were allowed a maximum of 1 room per family. They were restricted to these buildings except for a few hours in the middle of the day. Even then, they were restricted in the use of transportation and public facilities.
The nunciature organized a meeting of the diplomats who remained in Budapest and drew up a joint protest document in July 1944, and it was presented to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I accompanied Nuncio Rota and not only delivered the document, but also verbally protested against the persecution of the Jews because of their religion or race.
After the intervention of the Swedish king, Horthy, the head of state, he had stopped the deportations from Budapest. In the end of June or beginning of July, I gave him the message from the Swedish king, where the king asked him to stop all this. And he did an effort, really, and he managed to stop the deportations from Budapest. And that was the moment when Raoul Wallenberg arrives.
He was to us like a messiah, somebody who came from another country, and I have seen him when my mother talked to him. He seemed to me very, very elegant and a fantastic man. My mother went immediately after Raoul Wallenberg arrived and asked him to save my son. Raoul Wallenberg said, well, come back in a few days. I just arrived, I have to set up and to reconsider. And then after a few days, my brother was appointed as one of his messengers. He had few young boys who went from one building to another and was going with different papers and documents. And Raoul Wallenberg was very, very kind because he gave also the protective passport.
Raoul Wallenberg came with his ideas. These certificates were transformed into what we call a protective passport, with the Swedish colors on and the Swedish coat of arms. Spectacular document compared with the certificates we had made before.
The Swedish Schutzbrief actually looked like a passport, and it was necessary to look in a very impressive way, because, you know, when we went to save certain people and we took them here and took them there, then we sometimes met Nazis. We had to make him a little bit afraid that if he doesn't let this man away, then it would harm him.
By late summer, it was obvious to all that the German war effort was collapsing. The German army was in full retreat. They were decimated in the Ukraine along with the Hungarian army. In the west, the Allies had successfully landed in Normandy, France, and had begun to advance in France and Italy. The government of Regent Horthy, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, had sent a delegation to Moscow and sued for a separate peace. On October 15, 1944, it was announced on the radio that Regent Horthy entered into a ceasefire agreement with the Soviet armed forces and ordered an end to the fighting. While his announcement was read on the air, the German occupiers hastily armed the Arrow Cross, the extreme right-wing Nazi sympathizers, who then took over the government. On October 16th, Horthy and his family were exiled to Germany. With the Arrow Cross thugs armed and in power, a horrific reign of terror began for the Jews.
I arrived in Budapest on October 15th, on the day Regent Horthy announced Hungary's withdrawal from the war. I, of course, was extremely happy to hear that. When in the afternoon I arrived in the vicinity of the Eastern Railroad station, I realized that the Germans and the extreme right-wing Arrow Cross Party ceased power. Under the circumstances, I didn't dare go into the railroad station. I went to the nearby racing stables called Tatarsal, where there were lots of Jews, under the impression that this was a place safe for Jews. I realized immediately that this was an assembly point for deportation. In the confusion, I escaped from that place within minutes. I went into hiding for several weeks.
The Arrow Cross government, which in fact was a puppet regime of the German SS, took the persecution of the Budapest Jews to an unprecedented level. Preparations to deport the remaining Jews of Hungary from Budapest to the death camps were resumed. As a first step, the Jews were to be concentrated in a sealed ghetto. When the diplomats found out about this, they all started issuing as many protective passes as possible.
The active person for the relief work for the Jewish people, his name was Lutz. He was the consul. He took over also the relief work for the Jewish people. So he was the main actor on the Swiss side for helping the Jewish people. There was a very close cooperation between him and Wallenberg, of course.
He created something which was completely illegal. He knew that. He didn't care. And these are the collective passports, because always thousands of the names of the people who were supposed to emigrate to Palestine, their names were entered in a collective passport. And this was illegal.
I myself owe a great deal to these brave people. I consider my life to be a blessing. My life is a life that was not meant to be. You see, my parents survived the Holocaust as children right here in Budapest. My father, well, he was one of the lucky ones to receive help from the Swiss consul.
This street was jam-packed with desperate people from that corner to that corner, all trying to get into this building.
With people lined up on both sides of the streets anxiously trying to get in this building to get a visa in order to save their lives, how were you and Grandma able to get one?
Well, we were lucky. Actually, a man came out of the door who was working for the Swiss. His name was Mihai Salamon, and he was a cousin of my father. And my mother recognized him and called out to him with the name by which family called him, Mendy, probably for Mendel. And Mendy looked up and he noticed us and he took us inside. And we were there not very long, and we did get our papers, and that's how we were saved.
All those who asked for this certificate had only the name, the symbol of the nunciature, and the signature of the nuncio. He spent days and days just signing these certificates and gave it to all who asked for it.
Fortunately, my father acquired paper or Vatican papers, protection papers for the family. How he did it, I don't know. It was certainly not a condition to be converted.
The Spanish rescue activities were initiated by Sans Brise. Between July and December 1944, Ambassador Sans Brise issued passports to the few Jews of Spanish origin in Budapest, and on his own initiative provided protective passes to thousands of other Jews who could show any connection to Spain, no matter how tenuous. The passports and protective passes by themselves were not sufficient to provide safety to their holders. That is why Ambassador Sans Brise placed them in buildings under the protection of the Spanish legation.
There had never been a sealed ghetto for Jews in the 1,000-year history of Hungary. About a month after the Arrow Cross took power, a ghetto, similar to the one in Warsaw and other German-occupied cities, was established. Jews were herded out of the Yellow Star houses, taking with them only what they could carry. Walls 2 stories high blocked the streets leading to the ghetto. No Jew could leave the ghetto, and no Christian civilian could enter the ghetto. The average number of occupants was 11 persons per room. Starvation, sickness, and fear were the order of the day. Wallenberg, Lutz, and the other diplomats' reactions were immediate. They negotiated with the government to house those holding protective passes in buildings under diplomatic protection outside the ghetto.
We, and Raoul Wallenberg above all, negotiated with the Hungarian government, and we had the permission to issue 4,500 passports. And those people were lodged in big apartment houses, which were rented by us, by Raoul Wallenberg, or bought by him. We had about 30 houses along the Danube where we had those people staying and living. And that was the beginning, so to say, one part of what you call the international ghetto.
I translated from German to Hungarian the agreement designating a number of specific buildings which would be under the protection of the Swedish legation and the Red Cross, and clarifying the rights and obligations of the parties involved. Well, both the Hungarian and the German copies were signed by Wallenberg and Minister of Interior Affairs Vajna. Each time we visited Minister of Interior Affairs Vajna, Hungarian Army Commander Hindi, and some Arrow Cross leaders, Wallenberg gave them gifts of food, which had great value at the time. I distinctly remember he gave money, hard currency, and gold to Vajna and Hindi.
The money came from the War Refugee Board. That was mainly, I think, sponsored by the Jewish communities in the United States. And that made the whole Swedish action, or the Wallenberg action, possible.
Now, I think the first one was protected by the Red Cross. And then we had to move to one of the protected houses of Wallenberg. It was a Swedish house.
We are in front of the building which was protected by the Papal Nuncio in 1944, and both he and I stayed here and we played together. His name is Ivan Erud. We haven't changed for 56 years. I remember that we had Swiss protective papers, and we went to the Swiss houses, and they were all so chock-full crowded that they just couldn't let us in. So we went door-to-door knocking, and we knocked on the door of this building, and this was a Vatican-protected house, and they let us in. And that's how we ended up in this building.
Did the Vatican pass really protect you?
It protected us as far as we could live here in this house, which was relatively better than in the other ghetto. Otherwise, it was very often ignored by the Hungarian Nazis, who just came and made a raid and marched us out to the street, and then selected people and brought them away. My brother was also selected, and he went with them, and we've never seen him again. He died in Buchenwald.
The Hungarian Nazis began to reign. Then it got very, very difficult for all of us, because one day they gave an order that every woman between 15 and 50 has to go to a big stadium for work. There were hundreds of women there in this big sports stadium. We were divided into groups, and we began to march. We marched and marched and marched and marched. We met some other people coming from other places, also coming to the town. From them we heard that the Margaret Bridge was blown up, and those who were taken to Buda, the other part of the town, from there they took the people out to Germany, to these camps. And then I said to my friend, now this is the time when I'm going to escape. If you want, you can come with me, but I don't stay here anymore. So we went, and I knew exactly the town, so I knew that the trams, where the tram stopped, the road got narrow. And when we were walking in, 8 people lined up in one line. Besides, there were soldiers near us who were watching that we shouldn't escape. And who escaped, they shot him. So my friend said to me, "You are crazy, they will shoot you if they notice." Suddenly, we came to such a place, and I had such an unimaginable luck that I heard tram ringing. I heard it is going now to stop. And in the last minute, to the last platform, I stepped up. And in that moment, the tram started.
The worst part that I remember was the fear, because from time to time, the Arrow Cross did come and they searched the house for Jews who were not supposed to be there. Because you see, the people who were supposed to be in the Portugal protected house, they had some papers, and not everybody had papers.
Every night we heard as the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazis, were marching the Jews to the bank of the river and shot them in the Danube.
We took turns to go out for bread from our hiding place. On November 29th, it was my turn. I was stopped by an Arrow Cross patrol, and not having any valid papers, I was arrested as a deserter and taken to the basement of a detention center near the Danube. The prisoners were mostly Jews, but not exclusively. I saw a number of priests and many people badly beaten up. I was kept there until late at night, and then they selected 10 younger men at random. They lined us up on the street in pairs and marched us to the bank of the Danube. There, they lined us up again in pairs. I was in the 4th row with a fellow called Rothman. I never saw him before. 8 young Arrow Cross thugs surrounded us. 3 of them held flashlights, and 2 or 3 were shooting. The rest of them were just watching. The first and the second pair were shot and fell into the Danube. I was prepared to die. When they shot the third pair, one of the Arrow Cross men was wounded. He yelled out, "You shot me, brother!" The Arrow Cross men all ran to the wounded man. I was standing there in apathy and would have remained had Rothman not taken my hand and pulled me to the water's edge, where we found a spot to escape into the river. The current grabbed me, and within a half a minute I drifted to the support pillars of the ruins of the Margaret Bridge. We couldn't have been in the water more than a half a minute, and we were able to climb onto these structures. We were soaking wet. We were shivering. I don't know how we survived. We spent about 2 hours there. When we thought there might not be more Arrow Cross patrols out, we climbed onto the unexploded portion of the bridge near the riverbank. I recalled that on the corner of Kertész and Veselényi streets, the Swiss set up a protected hospital for the Jews. We started to run, then walk, and finally stagger. The will to live helped me. When we arrived there, they opened the door, and I just fell in there.
As the Soviet army was closing the noose around the city, overcrowding and starvation became almost as severe in the protected buildings as in the walled ghetto, compounded by the fear of frequent Arrow Cross raids.
I went back to the house where we lived before, and there I heard that my family moved over to a protected house at the St. István Park. I went there, and there I found my family. And I went into that flat, and there were, it was also a 4-room flat, and there were 42 people. I was the 43rd. So we were sleeping with my sister on the gas stove. First of all, I couldn't sleep, and the second, I thought it is very good there will be a place in the staircase to strengthen my legs. In order to keep my condition and to win the Olympics, I was running up and down 5 stories 100 times every day.
You told me this story about the nuts, right?
Yeah, well, I found a walnut just about here, and I cracked it open and very carefully put it in my mouth. I wanted to chew it, but you were quicker. You pried my mouth open, snatched it out of my mouth, and swallowed it. So the adults here thought that now we're going to have a fight to the death. But I was so stunned, I just said, if he's so hungry that he is willing to eat a walnut from my mouth, he should have it.
The Spanish protected house we were in was St. István Park 35. There is now a plaque on it in memory of Sans Briz and Perlaska. The rescue activities were begun by Sans Briz. Later, he was assisted by Perlaska, who had originally been an Italian fascist and had fought in the Spanish Civil War on Franco's side. He was a merchant who got stranded in Hungary when Italy changed sides in the war, and as a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, asked Sans Briz to help him stay out of an internment camp. Sans Briz gave Perlaska a Spanish passport and a new identity as Jorge Perlaska. The Italian became the most energetic helper in the Jewish rescue activities of the legation. When Sans Briz was ordered by his government to leave Hungary as the Russians were approaching, he left all official forms and his signature stamp for Perlaska. Perlaska continued to issue protective passes and assumed the role of Spanish chargé d'affaires. Now that Sans Brise was gone, the Nazis again wanted to take us into the ghetto. But Perlaska went to the Minister of the Interior, and he spoke with authority to the minister and said that if they harm any of the Jews under Spanish protection, the Spanish government will retaliate against Hungarian subjects living in Spain. He slammed his fist on the table and said nobody should bother those Spanish Jews. The stunned government officials told him this was not proper conduct for a diplomat. Of course, no one knew that he was not truly a diplomat.
The Spanish legation was headed by Senor Sans Brise, who was a wonderful man. Other than Wallenberg, there was nobody like him. We knew if something happened, someone could always call his private line, as long as there was telephone, and someone immediately came with the embassy car and made sure that the Arrow Cross would not take anybody away.
He was saving a lot of people that they used to call him by night, send rescue. He sent a chauffeur, and many times he went himself.
That was really important for him, that people had survived thanks to him, and that they remembered, because it is true that the Jewish people are very grateful.
He was doing what he was doing, saving all people and risking his life and his career. He was very proud to be able to do that. First of all, to save those people, and second, very proud to be able to pay for that.
He used to go to the railway stations and say, has anybody here got anything to do with Spain? And hoping against hope that somebody out of the line of Jewish people who were lining up to get into the train would say, yes, yes. And somebody suddenly came out of the queue and said yes, and then he took them away.
I have some recollection that she was on her way, still in Budapest. And then someone came along and just shouted out that all those with a Schutzpass, they should get out of the line. So that's how my mother survived.
Let me give you an example of how Wallenberg operated. Wallenberg obtained forged military orders from cooperating Hungarian officers, ordering the release of Jews to him as the neutral intermediary in exchange for high-ranking German prisoners of war. Well, with that, an embassy car and a small truck, we went in search of the death marches on the highway leading to Vienna. We located the officer in charge of the march and presented him with the release orders, while guns were pointed at us. When the commander refused, Wallenberg demanded his name and asked me to translate. I want to know the name of the officer so I could report who, against orders, refuses to exchange 10 Jews for one high-ranking German officer. This worked. We then filled the truck, usually with 15 Jews, and took them back to Budapest. I took part in such actions 7 or 8 times.
He used all the means to save people's lives. He was threatening them. He was using very hard voice, and they were impressed by this. They respected him. He used all kinds of tricks to save people's lives. I learned very much from Raoul how he worked. So one day he telephoned me and said, I have other things to do just now. I have to go to that and that station, but there is a second railway station. Could you go there? I know there's a train with leaving soon for Auschwitz. So I went there, and the train was just about to leave. And I asked the German commander at the station to stop it and said, open the car. This was a kind of cattle cars, you know. Open that because there are must be people there with Swedish passports. And he said, well, who are you? And I don't obey anything here. And I said, well, I'm a Swedish diplomat, and if you don't open that, I will report to your chief. Fesenmeier was the German ambassador in Budapest at the time. We had diplomatic relations with the German embassy. So I said, if you don't open it, I will report to him. Oh yes, sir. And he opened the doors, and I went in and asked those people who were about in those two cars. I mean, 100 people. Do you have any passports to show, Swedish passports? And there were only 2 people who showed protective passports. And then followed Ralph Wallenberg's sort of the model. I said, well, I recognize you, all of you. You have been to the office and you have got passport. Have you forgotten them? Do you have any documents to show that you have passports? Oh, well, they understood, and they showed some driving licenses, some receipts or whatever in Hungarian language. So I said, oh, that's good. That proves that you have the passport, and now you follow me. And there was in the Hungarian language, the German officer didn't understand Hungarian, so he also thought that this was kind of a legal document. And after I went, and with the help of a Hungarian officer who was helping us in all secrecy, was standing there with his uniform and all the medals, I said to this Hungarian officer, well, you take over these people now. Yes, sir. And the German was very pleased to see that, because now they will be taken away to prison. And he took them all the way to the Swedish houses.
The diplomats in Budapest did not only face the dangers of a city under siege and constant bombardment that accompanies a war, but were also exposed to the random, unlawful acts of the Arrow Cross. Harald Feller, who was a Swiss diplomat, recalls 2 incidents.
I recall a life-threatening incident on December 29, 1944. I was traveling by car with my secretary and chauffeur from my residence to the legation, when on Andrassy Street, the Arrow Cross men stopped us and dragged us out of the car and took us to Arrow Cross headquarters at Andrassy Street 60. They tore off all my clothes and threatened to shoot me and left me in an unheated room. After a few hours, I managed to escape. Shortly afterwards, we found out that the Arrow Cross accused the Swedes of spying for the Soviets and broke into the Swedish legation and arrested the diplomats and the employees. Fortunately, we found them and obtained their release and took them to the Swiss living quarters. I took Minister Danielsson, the senior Swedish diplomat, to my place, to the Esterhazy Palace.
By January 5th, 1945, the Arrow Cross disregarded all agreements with the diplomats and began to herd the Jews from the protected buildings to the general ghetto in preparation for their total annihilation.
We were marching towards the ghetto from around here. We were coming from the protected house, which is quite a distance from here, and we were getting rather tired. And as we were passing this very gate, 2 boys about our age were throwing snowballs at us and yelling out "Büdös Zsidó," which means stinking Jew. And I was very shocked that that boys of my age from whom I have never experienced any hate before, were doing this. And then we marched on, and we entered the ghetto a little down the road here. We can see it from here.
There was a general ghetto, 70,000 people around. And towards the very end of the war, just before the Russians were going to enter the city, the Hungarian Nazis were desperate. They had to exterminate as many Jewish people as possible. So they decided, the Hungarian Nazi government decided to blow up the whole ghetto in the air. And they had already put cannons around with artillery and to shoot around directly into the ghetto. When one of Raoul Wallenberg's, one of the member of his staff, he heard about that, and he couldn't find, and it was very urgent, he couldn't find Raoul Wallenberg. So he took upon him to telephone to the German commander. There was an army general who was still there, Schmidhuber was his name. And he said to him that if you don't stop this action, Raoul Wallenberg will see to it that you will be hanged after the war as a war criminal. And the German general stopped the action. So that is behind the story that Raoul Wallenberg saved 70,000 people's lives in the ghetto.
On January 18, 1945, the Soviet Army liberated the Pest side of Budapest, the area that included both ghettos.
The survivors, heroes, and criminals of this darkest part of the 20th century will soon be gone. It is now time for the torch to be handed down to my generation to assure that the memory of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust will not be forgotten, and that the good deeds of those who helped the survivors will serve as a shining example for future generations. When we began filming, I was beside the scenic Danube River. As we come to the conclusion of this film, I'm standing in front of the Dohány Temple in the old Jewish quarter of Budapest. Along the side of the temple stands a tree with names of victims of the Holocaust beside a small cemetery. The Dohány Temple is the second largest temple around the world and the largest temple in Europe. As you can see, the Dohány Temple is a beautiful building, beautiful not only for its structure, but also for what it represents. This temple stands as a testament to the Jews of Budapest and around the world who have rebuilt their lives and continue to prosper into the 21st century.
On January 17, 1945, Wallenberg left Budapest with his chauffeur Langerfeld to meet with Marshal Malinowski, the local commander of the Soviet Army, and was never heard from again. To this day, the Soviet or succeeding Russian governments have never given a satisfactory explanation as to his fate. Wallenberg was honored by Yad Vashem in Israel and the governments of Hungary, the United States, and many other countries. Ambassador Per Unger received a hero's welcome upon his return to Stockholm together with Minister Danielsson. Afterwards, he was Sweden's ambassador to a number of countries, among them Australia and Canada. Throughout his life, he was active in the search for Wallenberg. He was honored by Yad Vashem, the Hungarian, the Swedish, and the United States governments. He also received honorary Israeli citizenship and the Order of the Legion of Honor from France. Upon returning to Switzerland, Karl Lutz was investigated for issuing protective passes which exceeded his authority. He was cleared of any wrongdoing by the courts and remained in the diplomatic service. However, he was never appointed to any truly important diplomatic post. Karl Lutz was honored by Yad Vashem and the Hungarian government during his lifetime, and posthumously by the Swiss government. Archbishop Angelo Rota was well into his 70s after the war and retired soon after. He was honored by Yad Vashem and the Hungarian government posthumously. Angel Sanz Briz had a successful diplomatic career after World War II. He was appointed ambassador to important diplomatic posts, including China. He was only honored posthumously by Yad Vashem and the governments of Spain and Hungary. Giorgio Perlasca returned to private life in Padua, Italy, where he lived in total obscurity for the next 43 years until survivors searched him out in 1988. He was then honored by Yad Vashem and the governments of Italy, Hungary, and the United States. In Italy, he is considered somewhat of a folk hero. Archbishop Gennaro Verolino had a distinguished career in the Vatican Diplomatic Corps. He has not sought or received any special recognition for his courageous activities. Harald Feller was taken captive and held prisoner in Moscow for a year. After his release, he was also investigated by the Swiss government and exonerated. He resigned from diplomatic service and had a successful career as an attorney in Bern, Switzerland, where he still lives. Feller was honored by Yad Vashem. Danish Polgar became a television journalist and received the Pulitzer Prize. He lives in Budapest, Hungary. János Sjöholm is the best-known concert pianist of Sweden and performs in the major concert halls of Europe. Ivan Erud is a well-known composer of classical music who lives in Vienna, Austria.
In 1952, I reached my goal. In Helsinki, I won this medal at the 200-meter breaststroke. It was the happiest moment in my life. I have won and the Nazis didn't.